And they're all blocking, like just in their categories, more than pornography. But also those categories capture things that you wouldn't expect. So there's been charities and sites set up to help kids who are victims of abuse and things like that getting blocked. So it's not just pornography at all. And actually calling them porn filters is misleading.
Today, I'll be interviewing Matthew, investigative journalist for The Conscious Reporter. He's recently written an article which is called Web of Deceit. I wanted to bring him on Total View to talk about this article and to get into the issue a little bit more. There's so much to this issue that Matthew has brought together and has laid out so clearly. So I'm really happy and excited to have him here today on Total View so we can dig into this issue further. Hello, Matthew. Welcome.
Hi, Jenny. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, pleasure. I'm really glad that you're here. So how I think we could get started is if you could just start by giving a summary of your article and what this issue is all about.
Okay, so the article is essentially just trying to uncover what's behind the government's policy to filter the internet in the UK at the network level. So this is about not individuals going out and putting web filtering software on their computers. This is centrally controlled filtering infrastructure being put in place on the main ISPs in the UK, so covering the majority of UK web users. So it's really uncovering who's behind that, how did it happen, and it uncovers the links to the key politicians, media, religious pressure groups, and the Bilderberg group, and their links to this policy, which has been really pushed since 2010.
Right, and what are they trying to censor? What are they trying to filter out for people?
Well, when they announced this policy, they were talking about, protecting the children. They were talking about the worst kinds of stuff, which you wouldn't want children to see, like child pornography and things like this, as well as just pornography. But the interesting thing is, child pornography is illegal, obviously, and there's a difference between that and legal pornography, and it's actually already blocked. There's an organisation called the Internet Watch Foundation. They have a system where if they find that illegal material, they send it to the ISPs and then they block it. It's called clean feed. Now, there are other issues with that because there's no transparency around it either, so it could also be overreached, but it is already being dealt with. So they kind of bring this up and use it to then roll out these filters, which, unlike that, which is specific, where they're finding sites and a human being is saying that's wrong and blocking it, these use algorithms. Mm-hmm. So, they may have a range of different things on them. For example, it could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be dating sites, all kinds of things. Each ISP has its own, and it's automated. So it's automatically categorizing sites into these categories. And if the internet user has that category ticked and it's put under that category, it'll be blocked. And these types of filters always overblock.
Yeah.
And they also sometimes then let through the things they're supposed to block because they're not a perfect system. And the interesting thing is that people were against it. They had a review that they released that the government asked parents and other people, do they support default filtering? And the majority said no. And when they actually got those results, it was during, by that time the Daily Mail was running its campaign, that they actually didn't even release a press release to announce that because they didn't want to draw attention to it. They just slipped it out quietly without telling anyone. But nevertheless, they introduced the filters anyway. So all along, they had an independent review which did not recommend it, and then they had a consultation with parents who said they didn't want it, but nevertheless, if you read the papers and listened to these politicians, it was like, people want it, we need it, it's a disaster, we've got to have it, and talking about pornography, but then they block so much more than that.
So it's not just about pornography, or they're talking about protecting children from pornography, but then the filters are filtering more than pornography.
Yeah, that's interesting. You can actually, look at the main ISPs like TalkTalk, BT, Sky, Virgin, and they're all blocking, like just in their categories, more than pornography. But also those categories capture things that you wouldn't expect. So there's been charities and sites set up to help kids who are victims of abuse and things like that getting blocked. So it's not just pornography at all, and actually calling them porn filters is misleading. this hadn't come out when I wrote it, but Open Rights Group have set up a site called blocked.org.uk where they check sites because the ISPs won't let you do it. And they found about of 100,000 sites they checked, about a fifth almost were blocked. So it's blocking a lot of stuff, and there's no oversight in place, no transparency in place to ensure that this doesn't creep over time. It doesn't get misused.
And those sites, not like they were like pornographic sites, they were the top 100,000 sites on the internet. So
yeah, it's all kinds of sites, and I think they even have stories on their site where you can read people's experiences.
You've made reference to the Bilderberg group in your article, and as we've been talking, what is the link?
The link really is that you've got this policy being announced by David Cameron, who's attending Bilderberg, and George Osborne's protege. George Osborne has attended 7 times, and she's been the one pushing this. And you also have media supporting it. And you have, say, a group like the Sunday Times, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, supporting it, and he's apparently a Bilderberg attendee. And then they had a sort of an announcement at Policy Exchange, which is a think tank, which was helped set up by another politician who's a Bilderberg attendee. So that you have, so you have government, you have think tank, you have media, all pushing the policy, or linked to the Bilderberg group, and everything that they do is in secret, and then they involve Western governments, and then you have other Western governments coming out after the UK announces this policy, like Australia and Canada, talking about that they want to go in this direction. So it does seem that if there is a sort of a global agenda to bring this sort of policy into Western countries, the Bilderberg group is exactly the type of forum where these sorts of things could be discussed. But of course, you can't prove one way or another whether that's happening because it's all secret.
What's interesting is all these people are kind of claiming the moral high ground, protecting the children, noble causes, but there's a lot of double standards with a lot of the key players involved. Claire Perry having a very vulgar mouth. The Daily Mail having the sidebar of shame. David Cameron not backing calls to remove topless women from the page 3 of The Sun. Like, what's the deal with that?
Yeah, it is double standards. I mean, it's just double standards that you can actually see on the web page of the Daily Mail quite clearly. Screenshots of the story where they said victory for the Mail when the policy was announced, and they're quite open about their support. Victory for the Mail, and filth, whatever will be blocked to protect our kid, and then you've got half-naked celebrities all down the side.
Anytime you go there, it's just like, come on.
And then of course people will say, but we're talking about blocking real child abuse material and stuff, real serious stuff, but as I've pointed out before, that's already blocked.
Another questionable aspect to this whole issue is Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications company who is an innovator in internet censorship. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and their role in this?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, before the network level filtering was sort of pushed on the ISPs, TalkTalk was already doing it voluntarily, so they sort of led the way. And they led the way with a filtering system called HomeSafe, which is reputedly based upon a filtering system. Well, it's actually run by Huawei. So TalkTalk is using this system operated by Huawei, and all their traffic goes through it, regardless of whether you have the filtering on or not. So you can turn the filter off like the others. You can contact TalkTalk and ask them to turn it off, but the traffic is going through it anyway. And that system, that software, is reputedly based upon GreenNet, which was a filtering system that Huawei set up for China. And they've taken the page down about it now, about GreenNet. But they used to have a page up, which you can still see in archive, where they talked about, they were setting it up to block malicious religious sects and things like this. And we know that, that sort of happens over there. And it's kind of a bit disturbing that the sort of a system that was set up to suppress minorities in another country has been modified to a free country, and now there's no transparency for it. And that was the system that David Cameron pointed to and said, this is a great system that, they've led the way. When he announced his policy, last year, he praised them. And he's praising this system that has its origins in China in suppressing free speech. So that's a little bit disturbing. And then, of course, there's all the connections that the government has with Huawei now doing, billion-dollar deals in its telecoms infrastructure, despite people warning that it's not a good idea because they're too close to the Chinese government.
Yeah, that's just a little disturbing, just a little questionable, but anyway, just one more tick in the box. How about you talk about now how the filters have evolved, how David Cameron has announced now he wants to add on more filters to the default on system?
First of all, these filters are themselves an add-on to other filters already in place, because there's been filters on mobile phone networks for about a decade, and those filters are really strict. They block heaps of stuff, just all kinds of normal content. There's also clean feed, where sites are reported and blocked, not by a random algorithm, but by people. So this itself is an extension of systems already in place. But since announcing it, we have seen the government talking about we need to target extremist material, I think, rather than illegal material, but just material that is extreme, whatever, and again, there's no definition, there's no limit on that. And we've also seen a government official talking about blocking unsavoury content. Not illegal content, but just content that's unsavoury.
What does that mean?
What does it mean? So because there's no, as I keep pointing out, there's no sort of oversight, there's no clear framework, limitations or transparency, these systems can be used to block a whole range of things beyond what their whole purpose for even being there. So clean feed, it's good, it's good to have something that blocks child pornography, but it's also being used to block, copyright complaints and things like that. And there's a lack of transparency to that system, which can lead to creeping. The same with the mobile phone networks. Their filtering system has been blocking like esoteric material on Orange phones in the UK, for example. And now with these filters on the ISPs, not only is the government talking about, that it wants to get all these other things blocked, and not only has previous experience showed that they do tend to block more than adult material, whatever that is. The thing is, now the government has these tools. It has a lever it can pull. So if it sees things it doesn't like, whereas before it couldn't do anything, because it has infrastructure that totalitarian governments also have, it can now lean on private companies, ISPs or whatever, and say we want this blocked. And there's nothing to stop them doing that, because it can happen through backroom meetings. And it's just that the potential for misuse and abuse is there.
Definitely. So in your article, you had mentioned that you are very concerned that alternative websites, alternative spirituality, and esoteric material may get censored in the future by the major ISPs. Is it because of everything you just mentioned? Because of what's happened with the other mobile networks and the Wi-Fi and just this whole kind of crazy policy that's unfolding?
Yeah, it's a big concern, because it's a precedent has been set by mobile phone providers, by public Wi-Fi. So Orange phones in the UK blocking universally acknowledged sects, for example. Who are these sects? How do you find out if your group is one of them? Sites which promote, esoteric material or esoteric practices, that was on one of their categories, and there's nothing to stop them doing that. And then on public Wi-Fi, there's been people who've reported that they were blocked in cafes or McDonald's and so on, visiting a site and saying this is alternative spirituality / belief, you can't access it. And in fact, Adaptive Mobile did a survey just at the end of last year, testing public Wi-Fi in a lot of places, and found that almost half of religious sites were blocked. And this was after a policy David Cameron and the government brought in saying, yeah, we need to clean up public Wi-Fi, make it family friendly, block adult material. But because there's no definition around that, all this other stuff is being lumped in as inappropriate for children, and it seems to be including spirituality. And so given that it's happened on Wi-Fi, given that it's happened on mobile phone, internet, what's to stop it happening on the ISPs? So that's really the concern. And given that there's just not any clear parameters, limitations, transparency in place, that is a concern, that in the future it could be targeted as it already has been elsewhere.
Why do you care about this? Why should I care about this? Like, we're not in the UK. Why should anyone else in the world care about it?
These policies, when they're introduced in one place, other governments can go, hey, that's a good idea. Or perhaps, they're all in on it. Who knows? But interestingly, after the UK announced this policy in the lead up to the election in Australia and later in 2013, the Liberal Party, who prior to that had actually been against default filtering when the previous Labor government tried to introduce it, released a policy like at midnight or something, like, just right before the election, explaining that they wanted to introduce a policy for network level filtering. A journalist spotted that and reported it, and there was an uproar. And, then the Prime Minister, well, he wasn't the Prime Minister then, but Tony Abbott, who was then leading the opposition party into that election, came out and said, it was a mistake. And Malcolm Turnbull, who was a communications shadow minister, said, I wasn't aware of it. He had to defend it the next day, just before the election, and he hadn't even heard of it. And so it's very fishy, that these people in the government don't even seem to know what their own policies are, and someone is slipping it in there, and they're going into an election, and then when they got elected, if no one had pointed out that policy, they could have said, we have a mandate for that because we put that out before the election and people elected us. But it did get pointed out, and they backtracked. And that was an extremely sneaky and shady situation. And then similarly in Canada, I think someone over there said, yes, we need to follow the UK's example. So you need to keep an eye on these things because it does seem that governments are trying to sneak them in.
Is there anything that people can do to stop this?
Well, there are a range of actions people can do. People might have heard about that there's petitions and you can write to your political representatives and things like that. But I personally feel that the best action anyone can take is to boycott any ISP that is operating a filter, because these are businesses and they do what's in their commercial interests. And if enough people show that they don't want that, then they'll have an incentive to stand up to the government and stop implementing these filters. At this point, they're just taking the path of least resistance. And I think it is important that people do make a stand, because it's really like it's a step towards totalitarianism, even though, you can turn them off, but there's just nothing in place to prevent this going forward. And we've already seen the mobile and the Wi-Fi ones go way too far. There's nothing in place to stop this, and we just shouldn't have this sort of thing in Western countries. So when you look at this, and then you look at, they're also looking at scrapping the Human Rights Act, which gives people rights through which they could actually appeal things like this. That's going to be taken away. It is important, I think, that we stand up for values that are part of Western society, which are things like transparency, due process, human rights, rule of law, all of this sort of thing. And this is just a backroom, shadowy arrangement with no oversight and transparency, and it just shouldn't be happening.
Right on. Well said. Totally agree. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate the work that you've done into this issue. You've broken it down so well, and you've helped me and other people out there just to see how complex and how crazy this issue really is. I didn't realize it before. Had looked into it 7 months ago, could see that it was very disturbing, but you have revealed the extent to how disturbing this issue really is. So thank you so much for your work, and I'm sure we'll have you on again because you're digging into some really interesting topics there on The Conscious Reporter.
Thanks for having me.